And we're going to go ahead and get started. So again, this is NIST CSF 2.0 from compliance to confidence. And we have Chris Camejo and Steph Saunders here to present. And you guys can go ahead and take it from here.
All right. Go ahead and get my screen sharing up here. 1 second. All right. Give me 1 second here. All right. And play. Can we see the slides? Everybody good?
Yep.
All right. So thank you all for joining. This is, as Rosa said, NIST CSF 2.0 from compliance to confidence. I'm Steph Saunders. We have Chris Camejo. We are part of the compliance team here at Trusted Sec. And Chris is our director of advisory services, which also includes our advisory team. So for those of you who don't know, I live in Pittsburgh. If you've ever been there or driven through there, we know how crazy it is to navigate through the city. And this is one of my favorite pictures because some people's security programs may look like this, where you have to make a decision and you're really confused on where to go. So with NIST, especially since there's so many different variations and ways to go, we're kind of curious on who is actually using NIST within their organization. If you're new, then this will be definitely informative. And if you've been doing it for a long time as well, hopefully it will help you navigate some of the questions and be more confident with your assessments. So what is NIST? For those who might be new to it, it's a laboratory and framework founded as far back as 1901. It's part of one of the nation's oldest physical science laboratories. And when it originally was developed, it was focused around industrial sectors to remove challenges during, kind of competitiveness when all of the industrial era and stuff was going on. The NIST mission, which still stays true today, is to enable innovation via measurements, standards, and traceability. And looks like a lot of people are using this today, about almost 80%, so that's great. So we have a couple of NIST variations. I feel like a lot of people are probably familiar with 853. There's FedRAMP, CMMC, some of the other 800 ones. Chris can kind of go over some of these too.
Yeah, and this goes to what Steph was saying, that NIST may have started during the Industrial Revolution, but has really kind of come into being one of the key technology pieces of the government and providing guidance to the government itself about how to secure systems, as well as to government contractors and private sector. And so there's a whole bunch of different NIST standards and frameworks out there. These are just kind of some of the highlights that we typically run into as part of information security. As Steph said, NIST 853 really applies to the federal government's own systems, can be used by private organizations, but it's it's a heavy framework with a lot going on in there. FedRAMP is for cloud services being provided to the federal government. It's basically NIST 853 for the cloud. NIST 800-171 will be familiar to any government contractors handling controlled unclassified information. That's the standard that they're supposed to use to handle that information. 172 is an add-on to that. CMMC is an audit program for those. And so those top 5 lines there are for very specific organizations. What about the rest of us? And that's where NIST CSF comes in, what we're going to be talking about today. A few other pieces that can tie into CSF are the NIST Privacy Framework and the NIST Risk Management Framework. And so getting into understanding CSF, we just went through a big transition from the old CSF version 1.1 to the new CSF version 2.0. And the biggest difference between the two of these is the target audience. when NIST originally wrote CSF, it was intended for critical infrastructure, power plants and pipelines, water treatment, that the United States as a country depends on. And so it was very much targeted at those types of organizations. And you would see things in the NIST requirements about, impact on the nation, being certain criteria there that makes sense in a critical infrastructure context. Lots of organizations outside of critical infrastructure started using CSF. And so that's what brings us to 2.0, where NIST has intentionally broadened out that target audience to industry, government agencies, any other organization, doesn't matter how big or small it is, what sector it's in, or how mature its security is. CSF is now intended to be for everybody effectively. No longer has that focus on critical infrastructure. And as part of that, when they did that transition to 2.0, there's these different domains within CSF that this CSF calls functions. And you can see the old ones on the left. There's 5 functions there. On the right, we have this new govern ring that's inside those old 5 functions. And it's not that this govern set of functions is entirely new. Most of it has been pulled out of those other 5 functions, and they've decided to kind of consolidate all of that into this new govern function that gets a lot into the risk management side of things that makes CSF2 more adaptable for any type of organization. And part of that adaptability is this core concept in CSF called an organizational profile. And this is something that's existed since CSF1, but a lot of private sector organizations that were using CSF didn't really pay attention to it, and they just tried to use CSF as a checklist. Apply it to the entire organization and go through and make sure that you've got everything in place. And we'll talk about tiers in a bit, but like aiming to always have, higher tiers than you had last time. And that's actually not the way you're supposed to use CSF. What this organizational profile process is all about is, number one, sitting down and coming up with a reasonable scope for what CSF is supposed to cover. Gathering the information you need to build a security program for that scope, which is generally a risk assessment. We'll talk about that in a moment too. And then you create this document called the organizational profile that says, here's our scope, here's what we're targeting for that scope. Now you can do a gap analysis and figure out where you're missing your targets, come up with your action plan, and then go and implement it. So it's a much more structured approach, much more risk-based approach than the traditional using CSF as a checklist of security controls that we're just going to throw in place because we've decided that we're just going to do what CSF says. And when we talk about scope, there's a few different options. And you can see kind of the key here is at the top right for dark green out of scope, light green CSF scope, and yellow being other scopes. And so starting at the top left, you may be handling controlled unclassified information for the government as part of your business operation. You could apply NIST 800-171 across your entire organization, but that's a heavy standard with a lot of requirements, and you don't actually need to do that. You can just apply NIST 800-171 to the systems that are handling controlled unclassified information, and you're in compliance. So what does that mean for the rest of your organization? Well, you can use CSF for everything that is not subject to NIST 800-171 compliance. So you've got CSF as your umbrella to cover the whole organization, and a subset of the organization that does the more specific compliance framework. Beyond that, you can break it down even further. All these other 4 examples on the right, doing things based on divisions where you have a certain division of the company that is going to implement CSF. You're implementing CSF for certain types of information that you're worried about protecting. You could implement it for a specific product of yours that you want to be mature for your customers, or you could implement it on specific critical systems. So you don't have to apply CSF across the entire organization. You can focus on the things that actually matter to you and carve out one or more CSF scopes. You notice most of the ones on the right have more than one NIST CSF scope bubble. So you may have different systems or different information that have different information security needs that have different NIST CSF targets. And when you get into those different scopes, that gets us into something called control inheritance, where one of the core concepts is having a system security plan, basically documenting here are the things that we're going to do to implement this security program. And you can have hybrid controls where maybe you've implemented something organization wide that then gets inherited, at least in part, by one of your systems. So that the something like a domain controller that is handling authentication for the entire organization that a particular system relies upon, but that system may need to implement it in a specific way. Uh, you may also end up with controls that are completely inherited, where the organization handles it. All development is handled in this example at the organization wide level. Each system doesn't have its own inherent in-house development capability. And so whatever secure development practices are all happening up at that organization-wide CSF scope. And you may also inherit things from external providers. The example here being log generation and monitoring. You may have a third party, SOC as a service, analyzing your logs that the organization is using, that then that system further inherits from the organization. So you can think of these as sort of these tiered scopes. Again, it's not meant to be one size fits all, which is what organizations tend to end up with if they try to apply just CSF the entire organization. When you start breaking up your scope, you can do a lot more interesting things where you're not wasting time implementing security controls on things that don't need them, or leveraging organization-wide security controls for other more specific tasks. And so some of the things you can think about as you write up that scope or determine what you want the scope to be is, why are you doing this? What is your core reason for implementing CSF? Is it to protect a particular system or particular service? Something that's critical to the business. And then working through what parts of the business, what systems, what partners, products will be covered by the CSF scope. What sort of threats and vulnerabilities and attacks are you trying to protect against? Because you could consider adversarial threats like hackers that we usually think of. You could also consider accidental threats. Are we worried about an employee making a mistake and sending sensitive information to the wrong recipient? Or environmental threats like earthquakes, fires, floods that can impact the availability of our information, or even potentially confidentiality if the front door gets knocked off the building and now anybody can wander in during an emergency situation. So you have to think at the start about, are we just going to keep the narrow focus on hackers, or are we going to go broad and also consider these other types of threats? Assigning responsibilities is also huge, making sure that we know who's responsible for developing this whole program and setting those expectations to achieve those target outcomes. So once you've got a scope set up, now we get into that information gathering phase to figure out what sort of security tiers, what's appropriate within this scope. And so first up, legal and contractual requirements, of course. If you've got some sort of legal requirement, you need to build that into your program. And more often it's contractual requirements that come up. Your partners are asking you to demonstrate a certain level of maturity, those sorts of things. You also need to comply with your own organizational policies, so you can build that in as part of your CSF program. And then your risk management priorities is probably the biggest one on this list, is things like your risk tolerance and how much you're willing to spend to make risk reduce or go away will be a key part of this. And also, of course, your resource availability. You can dream big, but if you don't have the time, the money, the people to implement it, it's just not going to happen. So consider all of these as you're developing your CSF program to make sure you're setting realistic goals for yourself. And this is an example of what that organizational profile could look like. These are pulled straight out of one of the NIST CSF guidance documents. And the top is the instructions. And you can see that they've said, okay, CSF outcomes, your current profile, your target profile, basically where you are and where are you trying to get to, and what are the reasons for that. And the bottom is an example, again, also pulled out of the CSF documentation that shows for a particular control, the PRPS-01, this organization has set out, here's what we're doing today with our current practices, our current status, our current rating, and then the target with a high priority and what goals they're trying to achieve. So if you're doing a CSF program, this is really what you should be doing right at the start before you even run out and start trying to implement all those security controls, is think about your goals for each of those CSF controls. And you may even end up saying, you know what, we don't need a particular control. It's just not going to affect our organization. It's not going to reduce risk in a meaningful way. So you may end up saying PRPS01, yeah, we don't need this and we're not going to do it because it doesn't affect risk. And that's okay. You don't have to do everything on the list. Another tool that you can use are called community profiles. There's a few of these out there right now, but there's more on the way. And this is basically for certain industry sectors, like you can see in the bottom center there, framework profile for semiconductor manufacturing. So somebody's put together one of these organizational profiles, considering the types of risks that semiconductor manufacturers are facing, and have put the targets in there and kind of pre-documented, here's what controls you should be considering and why and what you should be aiming for. So you can look through these, and these are linked from NIST's website, and try to find a community profile that fits you to give you a head start on this process instead of starting from scratch. And NIST also makes a template available. This is a screenshot of the template, which comes in an Excel worksheet that down the left side is every single NIST CSF control, and you can see the two highlighted boxes there, the current and the target. So you can document all of those things, like I mentioned on the previous slides there. And also note the columns C and D in the screenshot here, that included in profile and rationale. And that goes to that point of you don't need to implement every single NIST CSF control to have an effective program. You should think about which controls you need and document your rationale for why you're including it, what risk does it reduce, or why you're not including it. And these are the tiers. Another big change is that CSF 1.1 had a 5-tiered model, and CSF 2.0 only has 4 tiers. And they've also changed the names and definitions of the tiers. So you can see the old definitions up next to the CSF 1.1 tiers. CSF2 has done an interesting thing, is for each of those 4 tiers, they've split it out into 2 different definitions. And you can see on the left side is this risk governance. These are the tier definitions for that whole new govern function within CSF. And then the right side, risk management, those are the definitions for all of those other 5 functions. I should also mention that this is not meant to be engraved in stone. This is a starting point. Your organization may want to take these and adjust these definitions to better fit your organization's needs and goals. You don't have to implement this as written to have a successful CSF program. In fact, the most successful programs do adapt this to what they're specifically trying to achieve. And so from there, you can take these tiers and you can apply them to the different functions, the different categories, or even down to the individual control level within CSF. And you can see kind of on the left side is the very coarse approach of, okay, we're going to set our govern function to adaptive, our identify function to repeatable, and so on. On the right side is the more granular approach, where within the govern function, we're going to look at each of those different categories and assign it a different target tier, so that it's okay to not have everything be a tier 4 adaptive 100%. To have a successful CSF program, you may decide, like the ID.im identifier there, that partial is okay. That's all you need in order to address your risk. And so some considerations as you go through and select those tiers, of course, your risk management practices. This should all be driven by a risk assessment. Think about your acceptable risk thresholds. Think about your threat environment. What types of threats are you regularly facing? Again, those legal and regulatory requirements, any sort of information sharing practices that you have, your business objectives, requirements for your supply chain, and any constraints your organization has. Any sort of, again, resources is a big one, time, money, personnel, but also they can be political factors. It can be just if we do this, we're going to lose all of our customers. So we can't do that. So anything that may tie you back is definitely something you want to think about and document as you're going through and deciding what you're going to do for your CSF program. And then we get into that assess, test, document phase. Your risk assessments to see, have you adequately addressed those risks, or are there other risks you haven't considered yet? Your gap assessments, once you've decided what your targets are, how close are you to those targets? Doing the technical testing, the penetration testing, the vulnerability scanning to see what's out there that you can't get through a pen and paper approach. Testing the education and the awareness of your personnel, things like phishing or vishing attacks, testing to see if they're up to speed or if you need more effective training. Testing your incident response, all your contingency stuff, your business continuity, disaster recovery, doing tabletop exercises to make sure your incident response capability is where it needs to be. And then your policies and procedures. And everybody hates writing stuff down, but so much of this depends on having your competent, your detailed policies and procedures that align with what you're actually trying to do, not just a dusty policy and procedure manual that sits on a shelf that nobody ever looks at because it doesn't align with your reality anymore. So that you have a repeatable process. And so with that, we're going to take a deep dive into the actual CSF controls, and I will hand it back over to Steph.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm glad we kind of brought up some risk assessments too. So we'll put some polls up to see, who's kind of doing that risk management side of things. So obviously from 1.0 to 2.0, they've shifted, some of those controls to make its own governed category. NIST actually does have a pretty somewhat decent mapping on their website that if you're going off of the 1.0 controls from last year, you can kind of line them up with 2.0, but our usual best practice for everyone is go with what 2.0 has now. So now that you can kind of see on the right side here, the new 2.0 controls, that will kind of help you when you're going through all of those steps with the organizational profiles and what we're all including. So, like we said, governance being the most important part of CSF, being the hub to that spoke, and kind of breaking it down here, looking at that organizational context. So, like Chris was saying in the scoping slides, if your entire organization is in scope, then making sure in like the policies and procedures that that's definitely defined and that's consistent whether you're doing NIST CSF or even if you've gone off to a different variation like 853 or 171, making sure that you know what the organizational context is from a governance standpoint. Risk management, I see this a lot. We're talking organizational risk management, cybersecurity risk management, third-party risk, and pretty much everything that is included in the risk management lifecycle. Supply chain is also included. They do break it out separately, and this kind of goes back to that organizational profile too. Maybe you're not dealing with as much supply chain stuff, so perhaps that's one of those areas that some people do mark as not applicable. But it's still important to consider it from a risk management perspective with roles, responsibilities, and authorities, making sure, again, that we have the proper roles and responsibilities to fulfill those governance obligations. Having the right authorities, this means that you have somebody who is responsible for each of those areas, for each of those control families, and just for compliance in general. And this could be even doing your system security plan every year. Somebody who is accountable. It can be, management level above, but making sure that every year it's getting done and updated. And that kind of brings us to this policies, processes, and procedures too. So I know writing policies is boring, but it is one of the, critical steps, making sure that you have a policy that everybody needs to abide by. But along with those policies, especially in some of the other NIST variations, we have to have those processes and procedures to go along with it. So some people might have it backwards too. You might be having great procedures and playbooks and all of those wonderful things, but maybe you're lacking the policy to go with it. So to make sure that we're truly, prepared, compliant, having all three of those together is really valuable as we go through all those controls. And oversight as well. How many people create a policy and then don't look at it for the next 3 years? Even if there's no changes to the policy, it's still really good best practice to make sure that we're going over them on an annual basis and making sure from a regulatory standpoint also, if you're required to follow other frameworks, PCI is a good one, SOC 2, any of those, that we are reviewing those when we're supposed to be. So not just dusting it off and saying, oh, we'll look at it in 5 years. If it's required for regulatory compliance, that we're also doing it at those timeframes. So the government spaces, kind of just putting it all together, all of our people, process, technology. Do you have the right people, roles, and policies to follow the processes? Um, do you have the right people who are qualified? So this is an important part as well, because even though CSF might not specifically call out individual roles, we want to make sure that everybody is qualified to take responsibility for the areas they're assigned to and make sure that they have, this goes back to the training and education awareness part as well, that they understand the context of their roles as it relates to those policies and procedures. And are they in place for all areas? Making sure that, when we're doing that annual, education awareness training, or when we're doing onboarding or our yearly compliance checks, making sure that all those policies are in place for all areas they're supposed to be in, and that people are understanding that they've been updated, or if there have been updates, that they're getting that information to stay compliant. So, and making sure the people that are supposed to push out that training and make sure from a governance standpoint that everybody's following them, that they're fulfilling their responsibilities as well. So risk management. NIST does have the risk management framework. We're going to get into that here. This is the 7 steps that you go through for NIST CSF for the risk management framework process. And we kind of start with those management objectives. Like Chris said, defining, that risk appetite. Maybe we are defining our tolerances at this point. Just kind of going through, what we'll accept, not accept. That risk management is included in cybersecurity practices. This is often missed a lot, or definitely siloed in some larger organizations where we might have vendor risk, we might have third-party supply chain risk, organizational, and they're not all talking to each other. So some companies who have that enterprise risk management function might be missing out on the cybersecurity risk component of it. So that's the one thing I really like about CSF is that actually call that out, and that you should be including cybersecurity risk with all of your other enterprise and organizational risk as well. Strategic direction that describes the appropriate risk responses too. This is where we're going to decide if we accept, reject, mitigate, transfer risk, giving some strategic direction to those who might have to make those decisions so that they can make the appropriate risk response or have the options to make the best choice based off of what they have in front of them. Also keeping lines of communication open for cybersecurity risk and including those suppliers and other third parties. I know recently with PCI, this is a huge thing, having those third-party risk matrices. This is just good practice across the board, even if you don't have to follow other compliance frameworks. Making sure that those suppliers, like we said, maybe those SOCs of services, third-party vendors, that they're understanding that cybersecurity risk as well. Because how many breaches have we seen lately where somebody's database got compromised or someone's logging was compromised and we didn't know about it till months later. So I'm really glad that this gets called out as well. and standardizing the method for calculating, documenting, categorizing, prioritizing cybersecurity risks. Everything might have some different weights. Some people deal a lot with third-party suppliers, some may not. Some people might have different compliance frameworks that they would rate certain areas in their cybersecurity practices higher than others would. And then making sure that those opportunities are included in those risk discussions. So determining, where all your risk is at and how you're going to handle it accordingly. And this is from the NIST website. This is so you can understand kind of the flow of how that risk management framework should look like. Like we said, we have our executives, our top management there. I saw we have a lot of directors and managers on this call also, kind of being that middle piece to make sure that we are driving home the objectives from top management down to, the doers, the practitioners, and that everybody is kind of lockstep and aligned with where the risk management framework aligns and those risk appetites. And then also, implementing it as well. So making sure from the top down that the implementation is being communicated. And if there's any sorts of, changes as you go through it or things that need updated, that we're also including that and bringing it back up to the top in that cyclical process that we see here. And then these are kind of the 7 steps that we take to go along with it. So, preparing, categorizing, selecting those controls, the implementation is key, and then assessing them. Assess is probably, I would say, the most important as well. As you're going through the risk framework, are the controls that you have in place implemented correctly and operating as you intend them to? So if you bought a new piece of software, maybe for access management or whatever it might be, cloud software, one is implemented the way you intended it to be. And is it operating the way it should? Are we making sure that the risk we determined to buy that software, say, hey, we don't know where all of our accounts are. We don't know who's logging in, who's logging out. If we're using that to kind of mitigate our risk for, unauthorized account use, that we're using all of the features that we need to, and that it's actually helping us to achieve that desired outcome of lowering that risk tolerance. Authorized to making sure that, like we saw in the previous slide, that we have that buy-in from, those senior officials and that they are understanding the security and privacy risk associated with it. Because as we know, with some of the breaches, privacy and security is huge if you do get compromised. So no matter what your risk is, making sure that we have that senior level providing accountability there as well. And then maintaining that ongoing situational awareness about, the security and privacy posture of the system. And this can be across the organization or for, whatever particular system, going back to that scoping that you have in place. And we'll kind of switch to Chris here. We'll talk about kind of that risk assessment process.
And everything that Steph just covered is so critically important, and it's kind of the most overlooked part of NIST CSF. To be clear, NIST Risk Management Framework is a whole separate document. The details are in NIST 800-37, but CSF is designed to tie into 837. And what we're about to talk about in a moment is 800-30. And one of the big struggles I see is kind of the executive says, hey, we need to align with a security framework. IT team or security team, go do NIST CSF. And then we at Trusted Sec get that call of, hey, we're trying to do CSF, help us out, let's do a gap assessment. Okay, we can do that. And my first question is always, what are your targets? Because we've got those 4 different target tiers that we need to know what you're aiming for so we can tell you if you're hitting your target. And quite often the answer is we don't know. Nobody told us what our targets are. They just told us to go do CSF. And when we ask questions like, well, what's your acceptable risk level? What's your risk tolerance? it's the IT team or the security team. They don't know. Those are executive level decisions that need to be made about risk tolerance and acceptable risks. So that's where, CSF is more than just more than just an IT problem, a technology problem. This whole core section that we're spending a bunch of time on here really needs to be at that senior executive level. And so this is getting into the part that Steph just covered is kind of the setup, establishing all the kind of the prerequisites, the baselines, the risk tolerance information, so you're ready for when you do a risk assessment. This is the separate set of requirements within NIST CSF for performing the risk assessment itself. Identifying your vulnerabilities and reviewing your cyber threat intelligence helps you identify the threats. You figure out the likelihood and impact of the threats, you prioritize them, and then you plan your responses to those. So it's very much this process, as you can see with the arrows, you're flowing through this main risk assessment process that's kind of contained within CSF. And then we've got a few kind of extras over there on the right where they tell you to consider certain specific things as part of that risk assessment. And so that brings us to NIST 830, which is a step-by-step process that NIST publishes for performing a risk assessment. And they have three different tiers defined within this. Tier 1 being organization-wide, Tier 3 focused on a particular system, and then Tier 2 kind of sitting there in the middle is, looking at a particular business process or a mission that you have to assess the risk to that particular mission or process. And so if you're starting CSF for the first time, or you've never done a risk assessment before, Tier 1's probably the way to go. Let's take a look at the whole organization, figure out what your risks are, figure out what you should focus on, and that can help decide what your CSF scope should be, help decide what tiers are appropriate within that CSF scope. And note that I'm talking CSF tiers now. It's kind of confusing that 830 defines these three risk assessment tiers. I'm talking about the four maturity tiers within CSF. If you decide like, hey, we've been doing CSF, we've done our risk assessments, but we're rolling out a new system or we're adding a new business process, that's where your Tier 2 and Tier 3 comes in handy. You don't have to do the whole risk assessment over again organization-wide. You can do a Tier 2 or Tier 3 assessment on that specific process that's changing or on that new system that you're bringing in, and integrate that into your existing body of knowledge about your organization's risk. And so I'm going to breeze through this. This is meant to show kind of the step-by-step at a high level of how 830 works. First up, you think of your threat sources, your criminal hacker groups or your environmental threats, things like hurricanes, and you come up with the likelihood that those things are going to happen. And all the numbers in here, by the way, are just examples. And then you take those threat sources and you turn them into threat events, and you figure out the likelihood that there's going to be some adverse impact. And so taking that likelihood of occurrence and likelihood of adverse impact, you can get an overall likelihood score. That's what we've got down on the bottom, just kind of matrix it out between how often is it going to happen and how often is it going to actually have a negative consequence. From there, you start considering your vulnerabilities, the controls that you have in place, any predisposing conditions you've got, and that can get you to overall, people tend to call this impact, but you can also think of it here as severity for any sort of adversarial thing, or pervasiveness for something that's more of like an environmental thing. But really, at the end of the day, that comes down to it's the potential impact. How bad is this thing going to be? How bad is this threat event going to be if it actually occurs and has that adverse impact? And so now we can take that overall likelihood and the potential impact and matrix it and get a level of risk. So super high level, that's NIST 830 in a nutshell. Pretty often I ask somebody like, hey, show me your risk assessment. And instead of showing me something like this, they'll show me, well, here's the list of all the NIST CSF controls and which ones we have in place and which ones we don't. So obviously the ones that aren't in place are a risk. No, that's not how any of this works. You're supposed to use those controls to address the risks you find through a process like this. You shouldn't just be out there checking off NIST CSF controls because they're on the CSF list. And that gets us into supply chain risk as well. The government has gotten very big on supply chain risk due to some of the recent types of breaches that defense contractors and the government itself has suffered from. And so they've dedicated a whole section within CSF just to supply chain risk, and considering, and this could be your suppliers. You know, are you buying a server that got compromised before it was shipped to you? It could be your cloud service providers. Are they providing adequate services? Are the SLAs appropriate for what you're trying to accomplish and the commitments you've made to your customers? Uh, are your are your suppliers going to cooperate with you in some sort of incident response scenario? And doing the due diligence to answer all of these questions. So it's definitely worth diving into this because it has been a big concern of late from some of the attacks that we've seen going on. And so now I will kick it back over to Steph to take us deeper into some of the different domains within CSF.
Thank you. Yeah, and I've looking at the risk, questions there. That's really surprising. I'm glad that some are doing it annually, and I saw some weren't at all. So maybe that'll be, on the roadmap for some people to do, next year or this coming year. So since we have governance, scoping, and we just talked about risk, we can go through some of the controls. So, the control families as far as CSF, there's definitely identify. This is also where I include, kind of the risk assessment portion of this as well, is understanding the cybersecurity risk to the organization. And what a lot of people kind of leave out is the assets with it. So while we always say people are our largest asset, for this, we also consider like the data, hardware, software, systems, facilities, and services. I know we saw recently with some of those cloud outages, that can definitely be an identified risk, since many people kind of gone away to having their own data centers in-house. A lot of asset management, I think we think is mostly just laptops, phones, those sort of things. But as we start to get into some of those, SaaS, DaaS providers, that also applies here in the situation as well. So identifying all of those assets that we use in that cybersecurity lifecycle across the board. And also, improvement too, like making sure that we've kind of evolved along with our asset management and identification tactics, that we're not just looking at, the Excel spreadsheet or export of what physical assets we have, that we're actually kind of managing, the cloud providers and some of those not so physical, tangible things, and improving the way that we identify them as well. So that's kind of what brings us to that taking inventory. The controls that you went through with your organizational profile and scoping, those are really important from an inventory standpoint for identifying all of those risks. Making sure that if we have to update how we identify those items, that we update the policies, procedures, and processes with them. And this, I've noticed, has become a lot harder to do with things such as like encryption keys and managed services and things that are no longer those physical objects that we used to just check off and say, oh, we got all the laptops back, our servers are all here. Um, making sure that we're updating those things as well and that we're actually doing what we say we're doing. So again, we review those policies annually. I know it's boring, but that we're updating the processes and procedures to make sure that we really do have the full picture of that inventory and risk, that we have the proper roles and responsibilities. So if we're implementing a new thing, and we've seen this a lot with shelfware, that we have the right people fulfilling those roles and responsibilities to make sure that they're doing those access reviews, that they've identified some of those loopholes that need to be taken care of. And most importantly, evidence of doing it. Did you actually do the access review? Did you actually do inventory? Or are we just saying it to check the box? Hopefully, we're not doing it for those reasons. Protection. So now that we've identified everything that, is in our ecosystem, we want to make sure that we are protecting it as well. Identity management, authentication, access control are still number one. Um, making sure that the people who are logging into our systems, whether they are third-party service providers, whether they are maintenance people, whether they are contractors, employees, are who they say they are. That they're using an approved authentication method. There's no backdoors left open. There's no shared accounts. Maybe we're making sure there's one-to-one access between user accounts or privilege elevation, escalation, those kinds of things. Technology, infrastructure, resilience, with everybody kind of moving their backups to the cloud and having those immutable backups, making sure that the things that aren't in that new technology stack are also technology resilient too, and that we're providing the proper awareness and training to go about it. So as we kind of move to the newer age of protecting our systems and all those things, that we're training people on the best ways to protect them. So it could be from your developers, it could be from your SOC, it could be from dealing with the MSSP, because if you're not doing in-house incident response, maybe you need to make sure that whoever you're relying on understands what you need to know and when you need to know it. We could talk about platform security and data security as well, making sure that those are also protected, whether they are yours or outsourced. And detection. Of course, now we have more continuous monitoring, and I always find it fun when I go through some of these NIST variations of, do you have a defined interval? Yes, it used to be kind of an older question of, are you doing it daily? Remember, like running your antivirus every day or monthly? Now with the continuous monitoring, I feel like we have better detection capabilities, but also that comes with alert fatigue too, and making sure that we are able to take those adverse events and analyze them effectively so that we're not just ignoring, oh, we saw that account login, we're not worried about it. Um, Making sure that we are baselining the events that we need to, and that we're not just blowing off the low-hanging fruit because, oh, that thing always goes off. We should be having what I always love to call is test and tune day. So maybe on Tuesdays, we're testing and tuning our alerts. We're making sure that those alerts are continuously monitored. We've always had like critical dashboards. If something goes down, what are we going to do there now that we've detected that? In response. So I've lived in incident response for pretty much my whole career, and I can say responding is critical. So making sure that from an incident standpoint, we have proper coverage, that we know who's going to be managing that incident. Back to making sure from a governance standpoint that we have the right roles and responsibilities to do that as well. And if we don't, if we're outsourcing it, making sure that we have the right communication in place to handle that incident analysis. Are they going to be doing it around the clock? Are you going to be doing it? Are they handing it off? How do you guys kind of go through this together? And this is important for third-party risk as well, because maybe you have a form that if somebody does have a third-party breach, they fill it out. Who takes it from that point? And then also, if it does escalate and get out of control, are we going to, a PR firm? Are we letting legal handle it? A lot of these pieces, when we're reviewing some of those incident response plans, aren't fully fleshed out. Does everybody go through the help desk? How are we responding, reporting, communicating at various levels? And then, of course, incident mitigation. Who's triaging this event? Who is handling it? Who's going to get to the remediation point? If it is, mitigation, is it the SOC as a service? Is it you internally? Is it together? How do we make sure it is actually getting mitigated and not going to happen again? And also, is it being mitigated within those SLAs that we have defined? So recovery, nobody likes to deal with an incident, but recovery is really important as well. So at what point do we kind of transition from that incident response to our recovery plans, DR plans, business continuity, those sorts of things? We have, I think, another question to pull you guys on to see if you all actually kind of test those plans all together. So we'll kind of see who does that as well. And if this is kind of how your security currently feels, yeah, maybe we need to make some improvements. So this is a bridge here in Pittsburgh, and this actually did happen. And I will say the response here was good, but making sure that we're going through that incident response plan, business continuity plan, and this, being the disaster it is, making sure that DR plan also aligns with all of those, and well, that our executives are aware as well. So if this is kind of what your security team or security looks like currently, let's kind of put it together. So from everything we just talked about, how does it all make sense? These are the most key NIST takeaways that we have. Governance, obviously, being that hub to the spoke, identifying those risks, and scoping. Those are definitely the two most important things. Identity management, making sure we have eyes on all of the things. We always say people who don't have incidences is kind of scary, because if you don't, do you really know what's going on in your environment? And second off, do you have the right tools to know what's going on in your environment? Protecting all of the assets once you've identified those. Detection of anomalies once a baseline has been established and the alerts are tuned. I know this is a long, project, but I still think from an IR standpoint, that's critical to keeping your infrastructure safe. And plan, making sure, like we just saw up there, sounds like a lot of people are integrating those plans, which is awesome. Making sure that if you don't have these big three, that you are working to achieve that and you're testing them. And not forgetting those vendors and third parties with those as well. Reporting, making sure if you have other regulatory requirements or privacy requirements, that those are taken into accountability as well. I know NIST CSF is a great foundation. We just want to make sure we're not checking the box, and that we are using CSF as a tool also to make sure we're meeting all those other requirements. And then I'll let Chris kind of go over we have some top trends that we see, in compliance as well here.
Yep, just some of the things that everybody hates to do, starting with MFA. Everybody's annoyed about having to log in twice. But beyond that, access reviews, we pretty often see accounts get set up, permissions get set, and then nobody ever looks at them ever again. So you get a lot of extra accounts with extra permissions out there. Same thing happens with firewalls. Same thing happens with wireless. The number of times I've looked at a firewall rule set and seen an any except rule buried in the middle somewhere from like 3 years ago that nobody realized was there is it's happened too many times. Risk assessments, we covered that already. That's so often people just try to use CSF as a checklist without doing that whole risk assessment process. Real penetration testing, we see a lot of vulnerability scanning. Sometimes the pen testing is lacking, but also segmentation testing, going beyond just can I break into this thing, but checking to see if VLAN 1 and VLAN 2 are supposed to be separated from each other. Is there a way to pivot and move between those VLANs? And of course, those third-party service providers that the attitude of, well, we've outsourced it, it's not our problem anymore. Well, it's not until some breach happens at the third party, and then suddenly it's your problem again because it's your information that was lost or stolen. So just again, that whole supply chain family that's in CSF now ties into that, and making sure you've put some consideration into that before just moving everything to the cloud without a second thought. Uh, I talked about the top-down approach, having the executives buy in on this whole CSF process, absolutely essential. And now that they've pulled out that govern family and put that out there separate to kind of get that point across that this isn't just a checklist of things for the IT team to put in place. The executives need to be involved in these risk decisions and communicating the risk tolerance. Integrating security early into any of your process, your projects, making sure that that risk assessment is considering the impact that this business process change or this new system or system change will have on the security of the organization. And again, focusing, we keep saying policies, procedures, playbooks. Those are so critical. Everybody hates taking the time to write them down, but they really do help keep things consistent and make sure everybody knows what's expected of them. Uh, Third parties, again, going through not just the contractual agreements and your due diligence, but then ongoing vendor management, vulnerability management of the third parties, integrating your incident response with your third party service provider's incident response. And then just aligning everybody, making sure that everybody understands these requirements, whether it's CSF or any other frameworks you're dealing with, communicating them to all the relevant people so that you're not missing anything. You'd be surprised at the number of times where somebody outside the security team chimes in with a, hey, did you know about this thing over here? And no, they didn't. So making sure that gets covered. And I see a few questions already popping into the in-meeting Q&A here. So Steph, if you didn't have anything else to cover, we can
Nope.
start diving into that in a moment.
No, I'm great. Let's go to the Q&A and yeah.
All right, so I'm looking at one about how would you go about scoping CSF? It seems very broad. Is there a way to key in on the scope? Yeah, it's broad by design. This goes back to the change to CSF 2.0 is it's meant to be useful for absolutely any type of organization. So so you could literally say, you know what, we provide this service to our customer. That's our product. That's the thing we care about most in the world. And so that's going to be our CSF scope. And that's totally fine to just start from that super narrow perspective. Maybe you want to expand it over time. Maybe you don't. It's what's appropriate for you. Uh, the organization wide, there's certainly a lot of organizations that do that. But from what I've seen, the organizations that do CSF organization wide are also the ones that aren't doing the risk assessments, that aren't thinking about their target tiers. They haven't thought about risk tolerance, and they're just trying to use CSF as a checklist. You're going to have much more, it's a much more specific results if you think about, okay, here's a critical system. Let's build a CSF scope around that system. Here's another critical business process we have over here. Maybe it's your manufacturing process. Let's build a CSF scope around that manufacturing process because our manufacturing line costs us $1 million an hour when it goes offline. Focus on that first instead of trying to do the entire organization and spending a ton of time on that when you can instead get a much better program in place faster on a narrower scope. I see I guess this is more of a comment about maintain customer responsibility matrix, make sure inherited controls have been audited by 3PAO. I think that's a reference back to when I had all the different system security plans and how controls can get inherited. And absolutely, for anybody who's not familiar, 3PAO, it's a government term for a third-party assessment organization that you'll run into them in FedRAMP, especially making sure that that cloud service adheres to FedRAMP and it's been independently audited. So if those are the kinds of spaces you're playing in, especially if you're a contractor doing NIST 800-171, CMMC type stuff, absolutely, that's what you should be looking for. Doesn't mean you have to use 3PAO assessed organizations, but it's a great start if you can. And what else? Steph, feel free to chime in if you see. I'm assuming you can see them as I check them off the list here too.
Let's see. I know there's the one, what is the purpose of NIST? To increase security of our organization. Yes, absolutely. But it's also a framework to help you, to secure the organization as well. And I know for some companies, they will use this to help with, reducing costs from a risk perspective and also just making sure that they're compliant. So it's a good way to get into compliance if you don't have any other frameworks that you need to legally abide by, whether it's, like HIPAA or ISO or PCI. NIST is just great across the board. And that was the purpose of going with 2.0 so that they could apply it to all areas, of businesses, not just manufacturing.
And I see a comment in our question here about approach to using CSF to meet the CCPA 2027 audit requirements. And so we dabble in privacy as well. You know, Trusted Sec, we're primarily a security company, but there's some overlap there. So I'm really glad somebody asked this one. CCPA, for anybody not familiar, is the California privacy regulations. There's a big update coming out that's adding a whole bunch of stuff. And in general, I'm on my soapbox a little bit here, but security and privacy are two different things. Privacy is 99% about here's a particular bit of information. Who are you allowed to share it with and under what circumstances? And in some cases, it's when are you allowed to even collect that information in the first place? And what sort of notifications do you have to send out to the people that you collected that information from? What sort of rights do those people have? Do they have the right to say, you have to delete my information, or you have to correct this error, or give me a copy of my information? So privacy is really not technology at all. It's policy, it's procedure, it's process of okay, if somebody wants to exercise their right to request a copy of their data, how do they do it? Do they do it by email? Do they do it on the website? Do they send a letter in? Do they fax you? Who gets that? Who gets that fax? Who takes action on it to send a copy of the data to that person? So it's not security, it's not IT at all. It's really just having the business owners that are working with that information, having the processes so that they don't violate the law and that they can act when somebody exercises their rights. Um, Most of the privacy regulations have if at all, they'll have a tiny little bit of security in there where it will just say something like have adequate security. And so that's the tricky bit. You know, GDPR is like that. California CCPA used to be like that. Um, it's pretty rare to run into a privacy framework that goes deep into actual security requirements. So bringing it back around to what's coming up in CCPA, uh, you should be looking at two things. Keep in mind, a privacy audit is separate from a security audit. CCPA doesn't go into detail on the types of controls you should have. So absolutely, if you did NIST CSF, you did it the right way, you considered your risks, you selected appropriate controls to protect that private information, and you've implemented them or you're working towards implementing them, absolutely, you're on the right track, and you can have an outside firm come in to do a third-party audit to make sure you've done all the things, followed that NIST CSF process, and implemented things, and you're following your own policies and procedures. Um, but there's many other frameworks out there that you could use for that as well. And also keep in mind, NIST has the privacy framework, which is the counterpart to CSF, where CSF covers the technology security side. The privacy framework covers all of that policy procedure. How do we handle somebody's private information side from the non-technical perspective? So you can also integrate the two of those in that program. And then going back to that previous question on scope, this is a great example of where you may want to have a narrow scope for your CSF program. If you're worried about meeting a privacy regulation, scope your CSF program to anything that touches that personal information that's covered under the privacy regulation. Now you've got a nice tight scope that can be audited, and a problem that exists somewhere else in the organization that would have no impact on personal information won't affect your audit score on your CSF audit that you're using for evidence for these regulations.
Then we have one last one, just real quick, because I know we're over for right now. How can we learn NIST in detail? I'm working in Active Directory. How can this help me grow my career? That's a great question. So the one thing I love about NIST is that they publish everything on their website. So Chris and I sit there with it open all day. 853 is very descriptive and has some really good guidance for a lot of those access controls. But CSF does it too. So if you're just kind of starting out, CSF has some really good requirements there to follow through to get you started. And then as you start to kind of go down into the more technical realms, you can obviously look at some of those other recommendations and the other frameworks too. So looks good. Thank you everyone for joining. And I think like Rosa said, this will probably be up later on today. So hope you all stay safe. Thank you.